Hey, labas vakaras visiems. Thanks for joining us tonight. A very big special thank you to the Lithuanian Canadian Community Toronto chapter and Skaida for hosting this event for us tonight. I get to introduce Peg Perry, the curator of our latest virtual exhibition on the War of 1812. And Peg actually joined the Lithuanian Museum Archives of Canada after a very successful career at the Bank of Montreal. And when she retired, she was looking for something interesting to do. So we said, come on over. And she's now been with us for about 5 years, actually over 5 years. She is our technology guru. She's developing databases for us. She developed our website, and she pitches in whenever and with whatever question or problem I can throw at her. She always comes up with a solution for us. She's a woman of many talents and interests, and in particular, she really enjoys genealogical research. When I talked to her about the need to tell the story of the first known connection of Lithuanians in Canada, she jumped at the chance. So 2 years of meticulous research later, we have a fascinating exhibition that Peg will now introduce us to.
Well, good evening, everyone. This evening, we will be taking a deeper look at LMAC's new digital exhibition describing the very first footsteps taken by Lithuanians in Canada. I've had a lot of fun with this, and I hope you enjoy it too. We first came across the notion of Lithuanians having been here as early as the War of 1812 in the book Lithuanians in Canada, published in 1967. It listed 100 men and their places of birth, suggested they came as soldiers, and then all of them assimilated into Canada, making them the first Lithuanian Canadians. The original work was done by an American historian, Kostas Jurgela, in 1964, through research in the National Archives of the UK. Our project took a second look at the original work in order to develop a more complete picture of the circumstances and to see if we could more clearly identify the first Lithuanian Canadian. And we did. Let's set the scene, starting with Europe in the time of Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a time of conflict, expansionism, fluid national boundaries, and changing alliances between countries. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, composed of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland, had been absorbed into Prussia and Russia in 3 partitions. Napoleon came to power in France, intending to dominate Europe and strangle Great Britain economically. As he became stronger, the countries opposing Napoleon, facing a shortage of military resources, formed alliances, contracting regiments from other countries to assist. Ever the opportunist, Napoleon acquired armies from the nations he had overrun. Out of these conflicts, 99 men from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania somehow came to be fighting in North America, fighting for the British in a Swiss regiment. How did this happen? And how were these 99 men identified? The Grand Duchy of Lithuania no longer existed as a country. If you look at this excerpt from our list, many of the surnames do not appear to be Lithuanian. There were 2 primary factors in the identification. One was that the men were born at the time that the Grand Duchy existed. The second was that their birthplaces were towns and counties that were within the boundaries of the GDL, although there were a few exceptions. One man was identified as Litau on Brabant, and 1 or 2 were from Moscow. Because of the intensive research done by Jurgela around the place names, we accepted the list as originally identified, although we determined that 1 name was a duplicate. This is a sample of a regimental register for the de Watteville Regiment, displaying some of the men on our list. As the de Watteville Regiment was Swiss, the language used in this record was the German spoken by the clerk writing the register. Names of soldiers have been written as understood by the person recording, and many of the names are policized, as often happened at that time. You would think that inconsistent spelling in the documents would increase the difficulty of accurately tracing the men, but there were very few new recruits into the regiment after its arrival in North America, reducing this to a closed group. You can see some of the incredible detail we were able to elicit. Martin Linkowitz was a Catholic, single, 5'4", fair-complexioned with black hair and brown eyes. Most of the men were single and Catholic, although we did find some evangelicals and one old believer. We also know that a private soldier was paid at the rate of 6 pence per day, more if he was on his second enlistment. There were other foreign regiments in the War of 1812, and it is possible that there were some Lithuanians to be found in these. We looked at the Demiron Regiment, which also fought in Canada. It had acquired only a small number of Polish soldiers, none of whom proved to be GDL. The Swiss regiments tended to have one faith predominate based on that of its owner. The de Wattevilles were primarily Catholic. The Demiron was primarily Protestant, which may provide an additional explanation as to why we found no GDLs in the Demiron Regiment. Consequently, our exhibition concentrates on the story of the de Watteville Regiment, although the Demiron surfaced near the end of the story. Where possible, LMAC's research used original documents to trace each soldier. This is one of the last payrolls, called muster rolls, which shows several soldiers from Jurgela's list. By using the comments in these registers, we were able to determine what happened to many individual soldiers. From this, we know that Andrei Cocteau is still a member of the regiment and is on active service. Michel Korzinski had been invalided in Spain and probably was never in Canada, although he was still on the roll of the regiment. This is an example of how we were able to extend Jurgela's research with more detailed information. Back to our story. Ethnic Lithuanians had never lost their desire to be a sovereign nation. Men born in the GDL joined regiments of countries that they thought would ultimately aid their quest for GDL independence. Consequently, GDLs could be found both in the forces of Napoleon and the coalition forces that opposed him. Switzerland had little industrial or agricultural output, but being central in Europe was a pathway from one country to another. Swiss armies provided a force to defend Switzerland against invaders and a source of income by being contracted out to other countries. Swiss regiments were organized by powerful oligarchs with the approval of the canton governments of Switzerland. Originally, these armies were entirely Swiss. However, as economic conditions shifted, careers in the military became less attractive to Swiss citizens. Salaries in other industries increased, military wages did not. Eventually, the officers were Swiss, but the regular soldiers came from many nations. Swiss regiments were highly valued, and eventually the Swiss fought for almost every other country in Europe and sometimes on both sides of a conflict, avoiding fighting against each other. The de Watteville family passed ownership of their regiment within the family, from Uncle Frederick to nephew Louis. Louis de Watteville was an enlightened leader, requiring a high standard of courtesy and discipline. He formed a school used to improve the literacy of the men and educate the children of the families permitted to accompany the regiment. The officers and 1/9 of the men could have their families with them. All sergeants, plus at least 2 men from each company, attended school. By 1813, the British had taken more than 56,000 prisoners of war in the Napoleonic conflict. Ordinary soldiers were held in miserable conditions in prison camps or on dilapidated prison hulk ships in England and elsewhere. Britain bore an enormous expense to sustain these prisoners. Having been continuously at war since 1740, Britain also faced a manpower shortage. It made sense to encourage prisoners of war to switch sides and enlist in the British Army, separated into foreign regiments. Segregation prevented discipline issues between the English and their former enemies. Problems with language could be more easily dealt with. A foreign depot was created at Lymington in Hampshire, England, to handle the recruitment and management of foreign regiments. 60 of the 99 GDLs joined the de Watteville Regiment, either in Spain or England, during the brief period from July to September 1810. Although we found no explicit records for these men being held as prisoners of war, all of their records showed them as being taken on by Lieutenant General Charles Doyle, whose portrait is shown here. He was an administrator responsible for POWs in Spain and England. If not prisoners, the soldiers may have deserted from Napoleon's Vistula Legion or either of the two regiments the de Wattevilles defeated at Sicily. These were the Premier Polonais Regiment and the Austrian Beaulieu Regiment, which Napoleon had captured and made to fight for him. Once in the regiment, they were treated as any other soldiers were. They received the usual pay and clothing allowances. The enlistment term was set at 7 years. At the end, they could choose to re-enlist or be transported back to England and eventually home. The working language was a continual problem. This issue is amply demonstrated in the regimental records, which are written in French, German, and English, sometimes all three on the same page. British leadership attempted to impose English as the de facto working language of the regiment, but with mixed success. The history of the regiment is preserved in its diary. This page documents the move of the de Wattevilles from Europe to North America. The war on the continent was winding down as Napoleon had so overextended in 1812, and success shifted to the coalition forces. For Great Britain, a new challenge had arisen. The United States had declared war against England, requiring forces to be transferred quickly to Canada. It made sense to use the foreign troops. The English people were tired of the long and bitter conflict and wanted their own men home. The well-regarded de Watteville Regiment, without pause to rest and regroup, was sent to North America. Some were left behind in England and Europe because they were invalided and unfit to travel, although they remained on the regimental roll. 41 officers, 1,414 men, 8 servants, 45 wives, and 38 children sailed from Cadiz on April 6, 1813, arriving at Halifax, Nova Scotia mid-May after an uneventful voyage. The ships sailed again quickly. Bad weather caused the convoy to break up, but the whole regiment had arrived safely by June 7th at Quebec City, where they transferred to smaller ships to go upriver to Montreal. From there, some sailed and some marched the 290 kilometers to Kingston, Ontario, which was to become their main base for the remainder of the war. In North America, the United States had fought the American Revolution with the support of France, achieving independence in 1776. France was the major trading partner of the United States. In the Napoleonic Wars, Britain attempted to starve France into submission by blockading its ports, severely impacting the U.S. economy. The Royal Navy harassed the U.S. by stopping its ships in international waters and removing sailors it considered to have deserted. The United States, with population pressure on its eastern seaboard, desired to expand westward into territories belonging to indigenous tribes which had been organized into a defensive confederacy supported with weapons supplied by the British. This map shows the theater of war. The border with the Canadas stretched over 2,000 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean, inland along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, to the trading post at Fort Michilimackinac on the Upper Lakes. Total population of Canada was only about 400,000, spread along the rivers and lake shores, with few roads to connect villages and larger settlements. The British were determined to hold Upper Canada, present-day Ontario, and Lower Canada, now Quebec. The Quebec Mercury on the right describes the initial moves by the Americans, a three-pronged attack across the whole front. The first prong was to be a move across the western Great Lakes and into Upper Canada to subdue the Indigenous allies of the British. The second was a sweep through the Niagara Peninsula to capture the British settlements there, as well as the large settlement of York, now called Toronto. The third was to move northwards toward Montreal to take the port and the main population center. The British had only 1,600 regular soldiers and a few militia units made up of farmers and townsmen. Canadian loyalty to Britain was not solid, as many people were of French or American origin or depended on trade with the US for their livelihood. Although Britain struck first and successfully at Detroit, there was an urgent need to increase its forces. When the de Wattevilles arrived in 1813, the war was a stalemate. The US had command of Lake Erie and were in a shipbuilding race on Lake Ontario. On land, American campaigns had successfully captured and pillaged York and Fort George on the Niagara Peninsula. However, the Americans, plagued by wavering forces, did not hold York for long and were driven back when they attempted to capitalize on their victory at Fort George. Flank companies are elite soldiers. The right flank company are grenadiers, trained for assault operations, the tallest, strongest soldiers in the regiment. The left flank is the light infantry, the smallest, fastest soldiers used for scouting, raiding, and skirmishing. On September 21, 1813, both flank companies of the de Watteville Regiment were ordered to join the Centre Division of the British Army at York. There was concern about another impending invasion of the capital. They traveled by open bateau across the Bay of Quinte and then marched to York. However, new information identified a buildup of American forces at Sackett's Harbor, New York, about 30 kilometers from Kingston. As soon as the flank companies arrived at York, they were hurried back to Kingston by small ships. Their convoy escort never met up with them. So off Main Duck Island, near Sackett's Harbor, they encountered the American squadron under Commodore Chauncey, who captured them easily. 44 soldiers escaped, but the majority, 190 men, became prisoners of war. Among these were 2 GDL soldiers. The prisoners of war were taken to a prison depot at Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The loss of their elite soldiers was a big blow to the regiment. The rest of the de Wattevilles continued to be quartered at Kingston, working on the defenses for Point Henry. During this time, there were some changes to the regiment. Some were discharged because of their physical condition. Others reached the end of their enlistment period and chose to go home. One GDL died in April 1814, although we don't know why. From August through November, some deserted, most likely migrating to the United States, and the flank companies were eventually reestablished. Just before the loss of the flank companies, Louis de Watteville moved on from his regiment. De Watteville was an ambitious man and assiduously used his own social connections to advance his career. He was a professional soldier as a young man, and the performance of the regiment in Europe enhanced his reputation. As soon as he arrived in Canada in June of 1813, he developed a relationship with Sir George Prevost, head of the military in Canada, and dining with him several times. They got along well, and within a couple of weeks, Colonel Watteville was named commandant of the Kingston garrison. By August, he learned that he had skipped a rank and been promoted to Major General. He handed command of the de Wattevilles over to Lieutenant Colonel Victor Fisher, although he continued to own the regiment. No instructions accompanied Watteville's promotion, and so he could not be employed as Major General in Canada. These excerpts from his diary show that he did not want to take on a lesser role, so he sold his possessions and left Kingston on the 12th of October. When he reached Montreal, he learned that he had been designated by London to serve on the staff in North America and was posted to the District of Montreal. On the 19th of October, he set up his personal headquarters at Chateauguay. Just 1 week later, the Battle of the Chateauguay occurred. As you will recall, a major objective of the Americans was to capture Montreal. If they did, they would have been able to completely cut off the supply route for the entire British force in Canada, and the war would be won. Their plan was to head straight north up the river valleys to Montreal. De Watteville had charge of the defense, but the local commander was French-Canadian Charles de Salaberry, the first high-ranking Canadian-born officer in the British Army. The odds were not in British favor. The Americans sent 2,600 men to meet 1,530 British, mostly Canadian units developed by de Salaberry, plus Indigenous peoples from the Mohawk, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe peoples. The British used the Canadian Voltigeur, the Canadian Fencibles, the Beauharnois Militia, and the Select Embodied Militia, with small participation from the British Royal Marines and the British 1st Light Battalion from Kingston. Leadership on both sides was marked by chaos through confused or missing communications. De Salaberry did not inform his superiors of the defenses he had prepared. De Watteville and Prevost called up British forces without telling de Salaberry what they were doing. The Americans attempted to fight the battle using conventional tactics. The Canadians skirmished from protected positions and used deception to make their force appear larger than it was. De Salaberry's strong defense won the battle just as de Watteville and Prevost arrived on the scene. The Canadians did not follow the retreating Americans, and de Watteville was criticized for that, although it could have turned the victory into a disaster. Casualties were light. 22 missing, wounded, or killed on the British side, 85 on the American. Some historians claimed that de Salaberry threatened to resign because he'd not been given full credit for the victory. In the end, de Salaberry was recognized for his efforts. De Watteville moved on to minor administrative roles. De Watteville did not move back to his regiment until after the siege of Fort Erie. This battle, the Battle of Chateauguay, was significant as the first ever Canadian rather than British victory. It's May of 1814, and the regiment was still stationed at Kingston under the leadership of Victor Fisher. In a country with no roads to speak of, dominance of the lakes was critical to the success in this war. On Lake Ontario, both countries were in a race to build more ships. Oswego, New York, was the depot for supplies used to outfit American ships being built at Sackett's Harbor. The de Wattevilles were sent from Kingston to destroy the supplies at Oswego. Sackett's Harbor was avoided as it was considered too large a target and it had been unsuccessfully attacked previously. They sailed early on May the 4th. Poor winds caused them to arrive only at noon on May the 5th. Even though the Americans knew they had arrived, the British delayed the start of the assault until 8 p.m. At sunset, a gale blew up, and the ships were driven offshore, so the Americans had time to shift some of the supplies away. The attack finally started at 1:30 p.m. on May the 6th. The landing party included 200 seamen, a company of Glengarry Light Infantry, and the two new flank companies of the de Watteville Regiment, with the de Wattevilles leading. The boats grounded early, and the men had to jump into waist-deep water and wade while taking gunfire from the woods and the brow of the hill where the fort was located. Several men were lost in the landing, including one GDL soldier. As you can see from Mermet's colorful description here, the fight was over very quickly. However, the raid did not completely destroy the supplies, and the Americans, although delayed, managed to launch new ships. This battle was the high point of the de Watteville's time in North America. What followed was tragic. In 1814, the war continued to grind on, but was not coming to a decisive close. Neither side had been able to get consistent traction behind their invasion plans. The Americans had minor successes, but had failed to capture their primary target, Montreal. The British had captured Washington, D.C., but were unable to keep it. The American people were not behind the war. The U.S. Army was unable to keep experienced troops in place. Many went home when their enlistment period was up or refused to fight off American soil. Britain had great difficulty keeping its army supplied in the field, and the British people too were sick of war. The Americans had captured Fort Erie in Canada July 3, 1814. The British responded by putting the fort under a siege that was to last until late September. The Battle of Fort Erie was a single-day action that was part of the siege. Although the Battle of Lundy's Lane is considered to be the bloodiest battle of the War of 1812, this siege had more casualties. The weather through that summer was very wet, and supplies were limited. Sickness abounded in the camp in the swampy woods surrounding the fort. Many soldiers were sick with dysentery, and typhoid was reported. The de Wattevilles were a large part of the siege force. They too endured the uncomfortable living conditions, although, as William Dunlop observed, they did rather better than the regular British troops managing the difficult situation. Periodically, the Americans came out to skirmish with the siege force. In these skirmishes, many were taken prisoner by the Americans, some were killed, and a considerable number deserted. Conditions were becoming untenable. The commander of the British forces, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond, planned a night attack for August 15th, 16th, 1814, to push the Americans back across the Niagara River to American territory. It would not be a surprise, as he had been hitting the Americans with an artillery barrage for the previous 2 days. Drummond did not trust his troops. Wary of desertions, he had the roll called hourly. Possibly to maintain some surprise, he had 2/3 of the de Wattevilles remove the flints from their muskets. No accidental firing would betray them as they moved forward, but they would have to attack the Americans hand-to-hand with bayonets. Coupled with the night attack, this made for a battle plan fraught with risk. Drummond must have recognized the desperation in the plan, for he included a forlorn hope. The French name for a forlorn hope is enfant perdu, and that name tells you that this is a force taking on a mission where they do not expect to survive. This forlorn hope was composed of de Watteville volunteers who were expected to circle around the fort and attack from the river up a steep cliff to the American battery at the top. The rest of the de Wattevilles, led once again by Victor Fisher, formed the south arm of a pincer attack directly on the fort itself. The north arm of the pincer was formed from other British forces. The attack began at 2 a.m. The forlorn hope, as expected, met with heavy fire from the battery above. The de Wattevilles had been given ladders to scale the rough tangle of sharpened trees called abattis laid before the wall of the fort. The ladders were too short to cross the abattis, and they retreated under heavy fire. 5 times they attacked and failed. Not wanting to give up, the de Wattevilles then attempted to go around the abattis to attack on the river side of the fort, where the forlorn hope was already retreating. The two groups mixed in confusion in the dark, and some men were swept into the river. On the north side, a magazine in the fort blew up, killing or wounding large numbers of British and some American defenders. With such heavy losses, there was nothing left to do but call it off and retreat. The Americans did not press their advantage and follow. Drummond, in his report the following day, wrote a blistering commentary, placing the blame upon the de Wattevilles for the failure. Sir George Prevost, Drummond's superior, did not agree and sarcastically noted the failure of Drummond's leadership instead. Conditions deteriorated further. Autumn rain began. On September 16th, the British made the decision to end the siege. No transport was available, and so they delayed until September 21st. Morale was low, there was more sickness, and desertions were increasing. Although they continued to maintain pickets, the British became indifferent to the actions being carried out by the Americans and did not report increased activity to their officers. The Americans were aware that the British were building a third battery in the woods. Once completed, the British would be able to completely cover Fort Erie with cannon fire and would force the Americans to abandon the fort. So on September 17th, in a driving rain, the Americans carried out a sortie on the camp in the woods to destroy the batteries. The de Wattevilles, in the front line ahead of the main camp, were surprised and overwhelmed. The attack ended only when other forces came from the rear to assist. Losses were heavy and included quite a few GDLs. Louis de Watteville, who was transferred to the Niagara region just after this battle, was not blamed for the losses caused by the regiment he owned. After the battle on September 21st, the de Watteville Regiment moved to winter quarters in Fort George near Niagara-on-the-Lake. Somehow, in preparing for the retreat, the last de Watteville soldier to die in the war was killed. This soldier, Jacob Martin, was from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The casualties of this siege combined with the recent battle at Lundy's Lane, were about 10% of Britain's forces in North America. Although Britain was not losing the war, the cost of the standoff was becoming exceedingly high, making armistice negotiations more urgent. At Fort George, the de Wattevilles spent a cold, miserable winter, which certainly did not improve morale. In Europe, negotiations concluded at Christmas with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. It must have been so frustrating. Neither side won. The boundaries in North America were moved back to what they were before the war. It had all been for nothing. In May 1815, at the end of the long winter at Fort George, the regiment sailed to Sorel near Montreal, then camped, awaiting the return of the released prisoners from Pittsfield. The de Wattevilles were the largest regiment remaining in Canada and were detained because of the large number of prisoners that had to be returned. Britain's treasury was empty, and it no longer had a need to maintain a large military force. Regiments were returned to England to be redeployed or disbanded. Without a decisive settlement, Britain continued to be concerned about American expansion and needed to maintain some military presence in Canada. Even before the war had ended, authorities were already thinking about offering land in Canada on which veterans could settle. These men, already trained, could be quickly called upon in the event of an American incursion and would be already located on inspected invasion routes. And they wouldn't be paid a military salary, relieving pressure on the British Treasury. Both the de Watteville and the de Meuron regiments were included in this scheme. Most of the de Wattevilles were discharged at their old base at Kingston on June 15, 1816. The men were given 2 months' pay to assist with transition out of the regiment. It is possible that at least 2 of the discharged GDLs migrated to the United States. Prisoners of war had been paroled into the area around Pittsfield as labor for farms, and so the GDLs would have been familiar with the people and opportunities in the U.S. Land was offered in southern Ontario, in the Perth Military Settlement in eastern Ontario, and in the St. Francis River Valley in Quebec, where Drummondville is today. As you can see from the excerpt of the land offer shown at the bottom here, each soldier was given a location ticket indicating the specific lot he was entitled to. Each private soldier was offered 100 acres. Other ranks were granted more. They and their families were also to be given provisions for a year and tools with which to clear and cultivate some land, which was raw bush. After 3 years, provided the land had been reasonably cleared, cultivated, and a house built, the property would become theirs, and a crown patent was issued to grant title. 140 location tickets were issued to the de Wattevilles in the Perth military settlement. The de Meurons settled primarily on the St. Francis River. The de Wattevilles, who did take up the land offer, encountered obstacles. Not enough land had been surveyed and divided into lots in time for work that summer. Some lots were swamp and had to be exchanged for better. Some soldiers had neither the ability nor the energy to do the work. A few were successful and eventually attained ownership of the land. Others, discouraged, drifted south to the United States to find work. Initially, we thought that the GDL soldiers took land but gave it up, as we found no evidence of a GDL soldier being granted a crown patent. We worked backwards, searching the location tickets, and again, we found no GDLs who took up the land offer. By searching for travel allowances in the payroll registers, we found that 41 of the 99 men were repatriated, and we traced them as far as Harwich, England, where the foreign depot had moved to from Lymington. Harwich was closer to the men's ultimate European destinations. Invalided men were treated the same as regular British soldiers and were granted Royal Chelsea Hospital pensions. The injuries listed for these pensioners included wounds due to combat, such as musket ball in the left leg or contraction of left arm caused by musket ball wound, as well as disabilities reflecting the heavy toll taken by long stretches of military service in adverse conditions, such as pulmonic affection and just plain being worn out. Having a Chelsea pension did not mean that you were a hospital patient. It meant that you had a pension that was paid out of the hospital. We found evidence that at least 8 of the GDL men received these pensions. Now we turn to the last part of the story. On September 4th, 1812, 187,000 square kilometers of land chartered by the Hudson's Bay Company for its fur trading business was transferred to Thomas Douglas, Earl of Selkirk, to create an agricultural colony in the west, located near where Winnipeg stands today. He intended to settle the land primarily with destitute Scots and Irish, smallholding farmers who had been displaced by wealthy landowners wanting to graze more profitable sheep. Most Canadians recognized the Red River Colony later in Canadian history, associated to Louis Riel and the Riel Rebellion in the 1850s. But in its earlier period, there is a connection to the de Wattevilles and the de Murons. The map displayed here shows the massive extent of this land transfer. The key settlement was at the junction of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, a place where the interchange of furs and trade goods traditionally took place and was used by both the Hudson's Bay Company and its main rival, the Northwest Company. A violent confrontation between the two companies, resulting from the HBC prohibiting the distribution of pemmican, the main food source of the fur traders as they traveled, caused the deaths of several people, including HBC Governor Robert Semple, in the battle at Seven Oaks. The Earl of Selkirk arrived in Canada, concerned about the violence. Lord Selkirk's men met up with the remaining de Wattevilles as they were marching between Kingston and Sorel, and induced some of them and some de Murons to accompany them to provide military support to the settlers. The combined military escort group became generally known as the de Murons. In revenge for Seven Oaks, the soldiers captured and held for a time the Northwest Company's main trading post at Fort William, Ontario. Then they continued westward and became settlers themselves. Selkirk was interested in the Poles among the foreign regiments as he thought they would make good farmer colonists. He was recruiting more Swiss and Poles to emigrate and was prepared to provide a better land offer than the one made by the British already. In 1817, Selkirk and 5 chiefs and warriors of the Chippewa or Saulteaux Nation and the Kilistine or Cree Nation signed a treaty acknowledging the use of the land by the colony, paying the tribes for the use of the land with an annual quit rent of 100 pounds of merchantable tobacco. This was the first treaty signed in Western Canada that recognized Indigenous land rights. Up to this point in our story, having searched thousands of records, we had yet to come up with a single GDL soldier who stayed in Canada after the war. Fortunately, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Earl of Selkirk were meticulous record keepers. Their early census of the colony in 1818 identified in separate groups immigrant families, Métis, and de Murons who inhabited the colony. Among the de Murons, we found Andreas Cocteau, former member of the de Watteville Regiment. We found no records of any other soldier with this name in the de Muron Regiment, so we are reasonably certain that this was the one GDL soldier who stayed in Canada, at least for a time, and farmed here. The picture on the left by Peter Rindesbacher shows a de Muron in a peaked cap talking to a settler in a home in the settlement shown at top right in a picture drawn by Lord Selkirk. There was considerable friction between the Scots Highlanders and the de Murons, whom the Scots regarded as shiftless and rowdy. Swiss settlers and the de Murons found it difficult to fit in and left in groups to move south into what is now Minnesota and Wisconsin. As we know from modern times, the Red River floods, and spectacularly so. The worst of these floods, which is still studied today, was the flood of 1826, which required the evacuation of the entire colony. The floods made the relationship between the Scots and the de Murons even worse. The Scots claimed that the de Murons rescued Scottish livestock from the flood and then sold the animals back to the Scots at a high price. This is the final confrontation for the Demurons and the last group left in 1826. So the latest Andreas Corto would have been in Canada was 1826. And that is the end of the story of 99 men. From Lithuania to Canada, a story of courage and endurance. What was so surprising to us was how the story of these European men connected with not one, but three major events in Canadian history: the War of 1812, the settlement on the Rideau River in eastern Canada, and the Red River Colony. And in the end, we found that just one man assimilated into Canada, albeit for a truly short time.
Incredible.
Although I'm not a Lithuanian Canadian, this project had a deep significance to me personally. Richard Tunks, shown in the picture here with his Napoleonic War medal, was my third great-grandfather, and his story is directly connected to the GDLs. His regiment alternated with the de Watteville's, maintaining the garrison at Kingston. In the Fort Erie sortie, it was his regiment that came to the aid of the de Watteville's, and at the end of the war, he took up the land offer on the Thames River near London. By landing in Canada, he was very lucky. After the War of 1812, his regiment was immediately transferred to Europe and then to Ireland. On the way to Ireland in 1816, their ship went down in a storm. 160 men, 27 women and children were lost in the shipwreck. Richard, fortunately, was in Canada starting civilian life. Eventually, he had a second and possibly a third wife and 17 children. As I worked through all these lists, rolls, and records, I had a picture in my mind of both the GDLs and Richard Tunks. The similarities between the two stories confirm my thinking that no matter where we come from, we find common ground in our past. I've been very privileged to research all these men and put together the new information on the first group of Lithuanians to come to Canada. There we go.
That was incredible. I see so much praise in the chat, but if you have the ability to do a reaction, let's definitely give a virtual applause. That was astounding. Lots of congratulations. Maybe an easy question to start us off. Will you be taking this presentation anywhere else, or do you have any plans to share this further?
Yes. We have prepared, of course,